Yeah, well, you know, that's like just your opinion, man.
So hello and welcome to the Audio Opinion Show, where audio people gather to share their opinions about audio things. That's the entirety of the show. That's the shtick. If you wanted something more interesting than that, I'm sure there's some cat videos you can watch somewhere. I am joined by some of my favorite professionals and some of my least favorite professionals. You can decide which one's which as we go along. I am also joined and co-hosted by Andy Broughton, the fabulous Canadian, who is to my left, but who knows where on your screen. I will say, Andy, I jumped out and came back in, and now I'm no longer the first one on my screen, and I'm bothered by this. So
yeah, I like that you can rearrange things as you see fit.
Well,
you're no longer the first one on my screen either.
See, and somewhere there's a biblical last shall be first, or I don't freaking know. Anyway, let's get on with it. I'm looking forward to, and now Andy has moved to a completely different place, and and to make it more confusing, the one who's named Andy on is now. Oh, anyway, I'm completely confused. Let's go to the polls. Let's go to the polls.
Can you unhost me there, friend?
Oh, right. So you can vote. You're very persnickety about also wanting to be able to vote.
My voice must be heard.
Must be heard. I must be heard. Okay. All right. So this is the most important question. We're going to launch this question, and then I will read it off for those of you at home who can't see it on the screen. If you don't know what this question is about, this is the most important question. If you don't understand what this is about, you just need to watch more of the shows. So Count Rugen, 11 fingers. Nigel Tufnell goes to 11. Coincidence? Option number 1, this is definitely a coincidence. Option number 2, causation does not equal causation. Causation does not. There we go. There's my typo. It's supposed to say causation does not equal, correlation does not equal causation, and I knew I would throw a typo in there. Number 3, nope. It is not a coincidence. It's a conspiracy. Number 4, what a dumb question. Just no. And number 5, and most importantly, Wallace Shawn. So that's definitely coincidence. Correlation does not equal causation. Nope, it's a conspiracy. What a dumb question. Just no. And Wallace Shawn. Remember, you can pick more than one. I definitely think for next week's show, Mr. Broughton, that we will bring some freaking Jeopardy music, because that would make this part a lot more interesting.
Yeah, I get off light. I only have to run 2 videos. That's pretty good.
All right.
Be careful. You might owe people money.
Well, there is that. I got to find something in the public domain that will make everyone crazy. Okay.
Merv.
I'm going to end there. So I'm ending the poll because I can do that. So Wallace Shawn was the most popular answer, which honestly is funny enough that I'm okay with that. I don't even know what the answer is to this. I just happened to think last night, I was like, wait, the 6-finger man and the guy whose amp goes to 11 are played by the same guy.
You want to show the results, everybody?
Oh, I didn't show the results? I apologize. Didn't show the results. So yeah, Wallace Shawn was everyone's favorite response, which I'm good with that. So now we'll actually pick our topic. But I am looking for, if you have anything to do with the Princess Bride or Spinal Tap, I'd like to hear from you. Is this whole 11 fingers, 11 amplifier thing connected, or am I looking for something that's not there? Okay, so now let's talk about what our topic for the day is. This one actually matters. This is going to control the next hour of your life. So first option, what is your favorite audio pet peeve? I.e., what grinds your gears? Number 2, what does the supply chain shortage mean for the future of audio tech? Number 3, how do you feel about, quote, mixing in the box, unquote, for live content? And by mixing in the box, I mean software mixing versus traditional hardware DSP with a software like a traditional console. And lastly, what do you think the most rewarding thing about working in audio is? The most rewarding thing. So favorite audio pet peeve, what grinds your gears? What does the supply chain shortage mean for the future of audio tech? How do we feel about mixing in the box for live content? And what's the most rewarding thing about working in audio? We've got how many voters? Oh, I get a vote. I'm going to vote because I can. All right, it's pretty even. 2, 2, 2, 2. Okay, 3, 6. Okay, that's it. I think. I think I can count to 11. Literally. So, ending the poll, and hopefully not a terribly controversial result because it's close. But with 4 votes, how do we feel about mixing in the box for live content? Now, I'm going to do a little bit of preamble for this because I'm the one that picked the topic and threw it in the pipe. So this is becoming a thing that's becoming more popular in churches specifically for their broadcast mix. And so that's sort of then growing into some other things where they're just using a Pro Tools rig and a couple controllers and they're mixing their live show for broadcast straight off of a Pro Tools rig. It's strictly in the box mixing. Harrison now is starting to gain traction with the Mixbus mixing console, which is completely a software engine, no dedicated DSP involved. So there are people now doing live mixing with completely software-based products. Granted, we're not at the stage where we're putting that through PA systems and whatever, but it's an interesting concept. Thoughts? Ideas? Anybody?
Yeah, I got one. Does anybody remember a software product called Software Audio Console?
I literally knew already. I was like, I bet you Clive is going to go SAC. So please explain to anybody else who doesn't.
Is because I have actually used it to mix live shows, not just TV broadcasts, but real live shows. And the most amazing thing was that I found was for admittedly a very straightforward kind of band show was that I actually got very quickly very used to using a mouse and a couple of quick keys on the keyboard and could get around quite happily and do a decent mix. I wouldn't say I would like to do an orchestra show with it, but it's something that's totally doable, and it's certainly something I've done.
Which is, and because you actually have direct experience, I may ask you to weigh on even more. I looked at the Software Audio Console as a solution for the church, when the church I worked at, to use as an in-ear monitor mixer, because you could generate multiple full mixers like in the box, and I could basically hand everybody in the band their own full mixer to do their own full mix. I quickly figured out that musicians aren't good at mixing. And it's
so you got to do it for them. But with that product, you could do 36 stereo mixes, which, for a few years back was pretty revolutionary.
Well, and completely independently, like independent EQs, independent everything. So, really
independent
amazing.
full consoles.
Yeah. It was like having 36 consoles. Yeah.
Like what the Quantum is now doing for oodles of money. You can do that with something that didn't cost a lot of money back then.
Well, and explain to sorry, Mac, for the people who don't play in Digico land, what is the Quantum doing?
Oh, you can each aux send on each channel can have its own processing, EQ. I don't know all the details. EQ.
Every cross point basically on every aux send can have a separate set of insertable or standard EQs and dynamics devices and whatever.
So you can make a pile of consoles in one. Sorry, what's that, Andy?
Oh, I was just saying, thus the name Quantum.
Oh, okay.
It's like it's a matrix on steroids.
Yeah, it's a matrix with cross-point processing.
They got a lot of funny names on Digital World, Spice Racks and other things. I don't even know what they are.
Mustard. The mustard one is the one that gets me. It's like, mustard rack? Really? I don't like mustard.
It's that dry English sense of humor, isn't it?
I'm
mustard.
sorry.
Same with food.
So you have to explain to us, like, okay, so dry mustard is good? Like, this is a good thing if you're British? Like, I guess so. I like mustard. Anyway, so no other opinions. I picked something that literally nobody gives a rat's ass about.
Well, I was going to just jump in and say, in Clive's example of mixing a live band on the SAC, I think in that situation, it's a lot more acceptable than say in what I do, which is broadcast mixing, because people who are, it's the monitor send that gets me, is the return that you're listening to. Yeah, if you're mixing a band in a theater, you're listening to the band. But when you're mixing remotely on a broadcast, you have to get the mix back to you. That may not be that easy.
And Mac points to therein lies the rub, which is if the venue is too small, in other words, you are mixing the PA against the volume coming off the stage, because you are in a venue where you have to balance those two things based on guitar amps, anything else coming off the stage, so forth and so on, then mixing remotely in a booth, I think, is going to be terribly difficult. Maybe there's some workarounds that I don't know about or haven't experienced, but that is definitely an issue. There was a club in San Francisco that I worked at soon after it opened. The club will remain nameless. I'll just say that it was across the street from the Fillmore West, or nearby the Fillmore West. And the person who owned this club had a back office and had set up the mix station there, not in front of the stage, not in the house, but there, and had a couple of microphones, and he wanted everybody to mix from there. And I was about the fourth or fifth person to come in, because he didn't ask the other people back, but I was the fourth or fifth guy to go, this isn't going to work. Your bands are going to be very unhappy. They're not going to come back. Your artists are they're not going to get what they need. And I ganged up with another guy that he had hired, and we got the mix out front. And the workaround was, it was on a rolling table, and he could roll it back at night. And me and the other guy said, yeah, that'll last maybe a week or two, and then it's going to stay out front. And sure enough, we were right.
This question came up on the event that we're prepping right now, which is sort of the consuming all oxygen for the month of January show for us. It's the Washington Mardi Gras that's in the big Hilton down here. It's probably not even the big Hilton anymore. It's probably bigger ones. But there's a lot of anxiety about COVID. It's because it's 3,000 people in a 2,500 seat ballroom. Whole different story. But the question came up, what are we going to do with your operators? How are we going to get these guys to survive the week? The lighting is already moving down to case storage. They're going to put their programmer down there, run. We're going to give them an audio feed and some comm lines down there. But they said, well, Ed, can you do the same thing with your operators? Can they be somewhere else? And I've been doing the show for 25 years, and the question stunned me, because our operators, our crews are constantly in motion, dealing with multiple bands. The first night is 4 bands, the second night is 2 bands. It's a rock band and a 25-piece orchestra. There's constant queuing between the person at the lectern and the band that's on the other side of the stage. The band leader's on comm and taking visual cues, and the crowd is extremely noisy. And I just had a hard time believing I had to explain this to the producer. There's no way that the sound operator can be in a separate space from where the audience is, where he can appreciate how loud the audience is against the lectern and the band. It's just, there are too many moving parts to make that work.
But it's very interesting that we would joke when digital consoles came out. The big joke was, shoot, I can mix this from my bedroom. I can mix this from my bedroom, And of course, we're like, ha ha ha. Well, I mix shows from my bedroom now all the time. Now, granted, I don't put them in a PA somewhere, and so that's. But I can understand producers who are confused now, because people are actually, remote mixing shows. I broke the rules and let Kyle Churnside in because he's a celebrity and he's super special. So we let him in late just because He's a superstar. So I know I sent out a note today that just said, don't show up late, I won't let you in, and then just broke my own rule. But Kyle, I think you're new to the, have you ever been on with us? I don't think you have. So anyway, we're just going to beat up on you like we beat up on everybody, but I wanted to at least acknowledge why I let the new face in when I said I'm not going to let the new faces in. So yeah, mixing in the box from remote, do we think that's an opportunity that's presented to us now?
Well,
I
we've
have a
heard
question about mixing in the box.
Go ahead.
Are you talking about just on a screen, or are you having a control surface?
So great question. It's like, and as soon as this comes up, there's a lot of like, what exactly do you mean, and defining the terms, and what do you mean? And so, and it's like, I almost posed it as like mixing in software, but we all know that we're all really mixing in software, whether it's, that's what's happening. Ultimately, the differentiation is it a box with DSP and a user interface with a bunch of knobs and buttons on it, i.e. a console? Or is it a computer running an operating system, a completely software package, and there's no DSP involved? It's all plugins, maybe it's a DAW, maybe it's a mix engine, whatever. And maybe we have some sort of external control fader surface that we've added to that, but it's basically, but the whole entire console is running in Mac OS, or the whole entire console, finger quotes console, is running in Windows. Like there's no dedicated DSP involved.
And are we taking the application out of this? For example, we were just talking about, can you mix music in a different room than the band,
Well, and I think that's part of the conversation. It's, part of what's causing the church market to start doing this is, one, they've been pressed into having to do a lot more webcasting than they ever had to do before. And so there's lots of churches that are trying to add a broadcast console and then realizing they don't have the money for a broadcast console. They can figure out ways to split their signal with Dante or whatever. They can get it into a computer for $2,000, throw it into a DAW, mix it with a bunch of stock plugins, and create a pretty decent output. And it's a fraction of the cost of, and we don't, in that instance, they don't care as much about latency or whatever. And we've now got powerful enough processing and powerful enough plugins and everything else at a price point where, mixing in Pro Tools for a live thing, it's like you buy Pro Tools, you buy a decent computer, if you can get everything in with a MADI card or a Dante card or whatever, you're off to a much cheaper DAW.
Actually, I think I have to chip in here and say that the whole latency thing, if you're doing a live show, if you're mixing live, the whole latency thing is still a big can of worms. And the big overhead recording programs like Pro Tools will probably never be able to get down to the kind of latency you would need to actually do a real live show. That was the beauty of Software Audio Console, because it was basically handwritten in assembly language. And so it could get down. I was finding I could get around 2 milliseconds of latency from audio input to audio output through the whole rig on what was not really a super powered computer setup,
I worked with a guy. Am I on? Am I even on?
Yep. We hear you. If you don't hear yourself,
Okay.
we hear you.
I worked with a guy when I was with Midas in Vegas who ran the other Beatles show on the Strip at Treasure Island. And he would mix remotely from his iPad, and he commuted between Las Vegas and LA. And one time he got caught up in the middle of the desert past Prem or whatever, and he had to mix the show from the side of the road off his LTE. And he said his latency was up to 10 milliseconds. Now, in that kind of show format where you have a program show where you're basically just go in a lighting guy sense or a theater sense, you're not making the live adjustments as such for your room because it's already a program show. So the latency really doesn't matter at that point, as long as you're, and he also had MIDI control of guitar tones, effects, stuff like that. So his go button was latency specific. And I watched the show for the room when he mixed remotely, and several times there was audible latency problems, and that was just with bandwidth, I'm sure, but it can be done.
Where was his processing engine though? Was he remotely controlling a local computer at the venue?
He was remotely controlling an iPad or his phone. So the phone was hooked to the network of the console through a MIDI setup.
Okay, so basically the console was in the venue doing the processing.
Correct.
So there shouldn't have, I mean, the only latency issues would have been because of the remote link.
Correct. Like I said, he did it
like missing a cue because you were 20 milliseconds late or something.
I don't see how the small number of milliseconds should make any difference. You're sitting at a festival, you're 200 milliseconds back from the stage already. So 20 milliseconds shouldn't make any difference at all to your control. Lighting guys are famously having to push their cues ahead of time because of the distance. It's this distance of sound, the speed of sound. So 100 to 200 milliseconds of latency, it's a non-issue for control. For control is what I'm saying.
For control. Yeah. And you know, to not to turn into a commercial, but my good friend Andy Broughton built a program called Remotely Possible that I use on a regular basis, where I can remotely control Yamaha console from another Yamaha console. End of ad. Sponsored by Remotely Possible.
Get yours today.
Get yours today. But that is one thing that the control latency, depending on how far I go. I quite often am controlling a console in California from Georgia, so it's all the way across the continent. The control latency, it can be 20 to 40, maybe 50 milliseconds, depending on the internet, a bunch of other different things. My monitoring latency coming back about the same amount. So I make a change. The change happens 40 milliseconds after I push the button. I don't hear the change until 80 milliseconds after I push the button, because that's when it actually, I will say it is completely, totally possible. It's not really that big a deal. However, with regards to tight cues, just like lighting people, you know, have figured out how to push the cue, you know, and some of that was, you know, back with, you know, old slow dimmers that just took a while to move. And so lighting people have gotten really accustomed to being ahead of the beat. Very quickly, I kind of got a feel for, like, you know, and I do mostly corporate stuff. So it's like, oh, coming out of a package, you know, up in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And right after the 1, I'm pushing the fader, because then at 0, I'm there. You know, just little things that, you know, we're kind of veering off into remote mixing, but that's fine. It's still kind of the part of the same thing. We're talking about non-traditional mixing situations is ultimately kind of what the conversation is about.
We've heard the stories about the I don't know if it's a true story or not, but about the guy who was mixing one of the boy bands, and the audience the girls were screaming so loud that he eventually moved himself into another room or into a trailer or something like this to mix the show, because he couldn't sit in the room anymore. As I say, I'm not totally sure if it's a true story, but I've heard this story a number of times, enough to think that it's probably true. And his system engineers would walk around the rooms, make sure the levels are okay. But that's a situation where, you know, he's listening to monitors, doing a live show with video cameras and stuff. And this was a long time ago.
Well, we probably ought to parse out the multiple. There are more tiers, I think, to the process we're talking about than simply it's either a Mac or a PC, or it's a bunch of hardware. And there are really, you know, there are gradations in there. What's like a Behringer XR18? It's got the only knob on it is the headphone volume. I've got some Metric Halo boxes here. The Metric Halo boxes have XLRs on the back, and that's it. And if you want to talk to it, you talk to it on the computer screen. But you can mix 80 channels with a stack of Metric Halo boxes. This started back with the old PM5D DSP, where you could, you know, open up a copy of the 5D editor, and your console was the box. So there's really and then, you know, the guy mixing with an iPad out on, you know, the side of the road in Vegas, talking to whatever consoles in the theater. You know, they're all different hardware expressions of the same process. No, you're no longer hands-on with faders and buttons.
Well, and my good friends at ProtoStream who do a different model for remote mixing, their primary model, if they're basically remoting into a mixing console that is locally gathering, receiving, and then spitting out audio, is they're using a software mixing engine. I'm now drawing a blank on what it's called because it's a new one, but it's a Windows-based box running.
It was based on SAW, I want to say. Does that sound right?
Oh, I think it's called AMP.
AMP. Thank you. Yes,
but it was
audio
based
mixing
on that.
platform. Yeah, I always forget it because it's just a little too easy to
It
remember.
has its roots in that, I believe.
I think
yeah.
SAC is still around, but they seem to sort of faded into.
Yeah,
Security.
it is still around. I don't think
Yeah.
many people are using it. And the recording program version of SAC is called SAW, but it's all based on the same code base, really.
I mean, an LV1
And
is LV1
it's
is like
very
that, isn't it?
fast. Hmm?
The LV1 is the Waves LV1 is a system like that, is it not?
Yeah.
So I think we're definitely heading in that direction. As over the years, it's become less and less hardware and more software. And I think it just eventually it will be something like this. The box will be the controller, and the rest of it will be just computer hardware.
Clive, you touched on something that was very interesting, and we sort of kind of passed over it. Because when I'm talking about mixing in the box, I'm talking about kind of the current generation of software that's running on top of an existing operating system. But you basically you say that the SAC was from assembly language, like it was coded at a deeper level. Am I kind of understanding that right? And
That's
that was
right,
one of the
yeah.
ways that they were able to get, well, for one thing, they were able to get a tremendous amount of processing back when we didn't have ridiculous processing power, but then also getting the latency. I don't know, maybe somebody else knows. Is there anyone else doing at that level now?
Well, actually, if you think about it for a minute, just about every digital desk pretty much works the same way. I mean, they're pretty much hand coded, and sure, it's blocks of DSPs, whereas SAC was all written inside Intel chips,
Right.
But the process would be the same.
Sure.
The objective is to maximize the amount of data you can get through, and to be able to clock consistently and to meet a specific latency kind of requirement, no matter what the mix path. So I think the challenge of whether you do it on a Intel-based PC or a Mac PC, or whether you do it inside a custom DSP-based desk, is sort of looking at the same problem and trying to optimize it, but maybe from different approaches. But yeah.
Well, I had a conversation on Facebook, which went like most Facebook conversations went. But it was, we were trying to parse out these categorizations of mixing in the box versus not, whatever. But one of the things that I was trying to point out is, like, when I think of like a DAW, when you're designing the software in a DAW, latency is not your number one concern, because you're just doing playback. So you don't care. Like, you can buffer it, and then you can throw plugins that add another 20 milliseconds or whatever, and you don't care. You just buffer all that stuff and you spit it out. It's not real time anyway.
Except when you're punching in and when you're playing, when you're
yeah, but I mean,
line.
when I say you don't care, I'm just saying that, like, the difference between 2 milliseconds versus 25 milliseconds, you don't care. When I'm using a hardware console in monitors, for instance, not that you know anything about that, Mr. Broughton, I care very deeply about whether it's 1.5 milliseconds versus 25 milliseconds. Like, now all of a sudden I very, very deeply care. And a lot of that then becomes the design parameters of what it is you're getting to. And I think we're still at, and that's why I was teasing that out, Clive. I think we're still at, for the most part, to get ultra low latency, some form of hardware DSP that's doing most of the audio processing. And what most of the consoles are now using Windows for instance, or whatever, is largely user interface. It's, how are we controlling that? And we've also, most of us have had an experience now with a digital console where something about the user interface kludged or clunked or did something weird. And meanwhile, the audio was just fine because it was not running through Windows or whatever. It was running through the DSP. When I'm talking about, and I'm just making this up, but when I'm talking about in the box mixing, I'm thinking literally like, it's running on top of an existing consumer, if you will, operating system, and you're just throwing, Pro Tools plugins at it or AAX plugins at it or whatever, and doing your processing completely in software.
Well, like graphics chips, I think it's always better if you can have some sort of dedicated DSP processing to take the heavy lifting away from the CPU, and also keep it a little more, I don't know, less crash prone, let's say.
Go ahead.
Would you look at it more like a broadcasting sense? And we've been talking about this in our show a lot as well, is mixing your show as if it was a broadcast show. And someone had mentioned about having system techs in the room doing the things. So you can actually have your analyzer with you wherever you're mixing from the box and give a good reference to what you're doing, latency not included. Now, when you're talking about monitors, obviously that's a huge concern because of in-ear monitoring and vibration of the person versus vibration of the return to the ear. That would be super difficult, and that has been a challenge since day one. When you approach the mix as if you were doing a broadcast mix, and someone said it really cool the other night, was like, mix as if you're running everything at 85 dB. And that way, when it gets to the room, you can just turn it up and down without repercussion. Then, like, we go back and we talk about the cues. Nailing the cues would be a practice of rehearse. But mixing live for something that's unknown, you're going to throw a bunch more variables in there as well. I think we could take a lot of cues from broadcast. Obviously, they've been mixing in trucks all the time, and we haven't. So being in the room, we're used to the vibration. We just have to change our work path, so to speak.
Well, and one of the things that's like, if you start talking about like, how in the world do I mix a show remotely for like what I always talk about as what I always call putting audio in big black boxes, if that's, and making them loud. If that's what we're talking about, if it was a stadium show, ironically, if it was a stadium show, I could mix that in a truck and it would be fine. If I had a good system engineer and somebody to basically maybe push the master fader up or down by 3 dB because of crowd noise, I could mix that in a truck. There's no reflections. There's no room to deal with. Once the PA is tuned, if I trust my system, if I'm in a club or a small theater where the room is playing with me and everything, it's a whole, now we're in a completely different place. Skye and Fred haven't talked yet. I'm coming to both of you at some point very soon. So be prepared to at least say, I don't care. And Erskine, I'm going to pick on you specifically because I know that you're like, your eyes are glazing over and you're like, oh, it's freaking fader pushing. Why do I care about fader pushing?
Yeah, can we talk about comms?
Audio, what's that? I've been on a couple of tours where the front of house mixer takes his iPad or his Mac or his PC. I don't remember what he had, but it was a touchscreen device, and just walked around the theater, and never, if he was too loud, he would come backstage. He would go to the loading dock, and he mixed the entire show. And of course, it was a tour. It was a fixed playlist, so he knew the songs by heart. He had presets for every single song. All he had to do was press a preset, and occasionally he might touch one fader, and on his computer it was like 96 faders all on one little screen, and he would just touch one, adjust it a little bit, and go on.
I remember this guy, Peter. I played poker with him backstage while he was doing what you're.
He does exactly the same. He actually on the screen, he has poker on the right hand side and the mixing console on the left. Exactly.
Do that for
just have to worry when he has solitaire on the right hand screen, and so, but that's a whole different thing than the other part of the conversation where we're talking about all software mixer versus hardware mixer. And I think that's something that is way beyond my experience. I don't really care one way or the other. And if it works, it works. It all depends on how you do it. Like you're controlling mixing from across the world, which of course is the ideal situation in the world we're in right now, probably because something to do with sickness, but who knows?
Yep,
or maybe they
the
just don't want to
sickness
see
and not
you.
getting down with it. Yep.
Exactly.
Well, both are a very real possibility. I will say, and I won't veer us off because otherwise Erskine will take over the rest of the conversation. I did do a thing that's a sort of like brain teaser to put this more in your world. I needed to party line a bunch of 4 wires into party lines, and I didn't have a matrix or anything to do that with. And
that's what they make mixers for.
Well, I didn't have a mixer. I didn't have the tools on hand to do that. And so I pushed it all into, I can't remember why I could do this easily, something about Dante, but I pushed it all into my Mac and I used Loopback and I created my own mix minuses in Loopback. I basically created my own crosspoint grid in Loopback. So essentially, the reason I bring that up is not to pat my own back, although I will. It was, at that point, I had a matrix comm system completely in software, which is kind of what we're talking about. Like there was no hardware, no DSP, no nothing. It was literally a program running on a Mac. Skye, I told you I'd pick on you. So go ahead, Pete.
That's a very moot subject. I mean, comm systems, sure, they have DSP, but they don't use DSP.
Right.
They're basically just an audio pass through with some routing, and that's it. There's no heavy processing going on at all.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I think what I'm really thinking is in terms of like where and Unity Intercom. Unity Intercom is a software intercom system.
Yep.
Skye, give us your 2 cents worth.
I wish I could say I don't have an opinion one way or another. Oddly enough, it's just that all of my experience in audio has been very small or low budget theater, and in musical theater especially, you don't really want to have that situation of mixing remotely because you have to be able to adjust on the fly, and especially mixing from the box, that's not really a thing in my world. Sure, clubs and things I totally understand, but like musical theater, I don't necessarily see how that is going to move from that to a software only engine of some kind. Sure, I think Peter mentioned that like occasionally an A1 will walk around the space with an iPad, and I've done that plenty of times myself, but I would never mix the musical from the iPad itself if given that chance.
I think what we all have to realize is that really the way that our mixing world is going to end up, and I think Brian pointed this out and Andy pointed it out too, is going to end up as really mixing in the box with external hardware to push faders and buttons. Most digital consoles are pretty much that now. And, and regardless of what kind of show you're doing, pretty much everybody's using digital desks these days. When Waves can put out a controller and a complete mixing suite that basically is mixing in the box, then really every console, in a sense, is that kind of device, I think.
Well, and Waves is, I'm glad somebody brought that up, because Waves now I feel like exists in this middle ground where it's kind of mixing in the box, but then you have this the LV1, like they've incorporated a surface, but then it's not really a physical surface, which is why I'm not interested, because mixing on glass sucks and I don't want to do it. I mean, if somebody made a surface that interfaced with the Waves mixing engine that operated like a surface, I'd be on board with trying that. Like I'd be down with that. And at that point, it's a freaking fader controller with an in the box completely software based engine.
Yeah,
And-
a few people do that too. I mean, like, anybody ever use a motor mix, a CM Labs motor mix?
I remember it. I don't know
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I ever saw one in person, but I remember it. Yeah, absolutely.
I've got one in a box here somewhere.
Yeah, and Waves does
You're
make
the
a
one.
surface, by the way. It's called the Fit controller for eMotion LV1. I don't know if they
Does it
make
measure
it.
your steps? Measures your fader pushes?
Just
I
you
mean,
wait.
I'm up to 10,000 pushes today.
Yeah.
So I will say that going all the way back to the SAC, they have set it up so that you could use various third-party surfaces. I know that one of our venues here in town had a SAC for a long time, and the engineer there
Still
went out-
does.
oh my God! So went out and bought a whole bunch of
He just likes
little
saying sack.
Behringer fader panels. And the thing that really kind of struck me about the SAC is, like, it's great that it has all that functionality in there, but like when your entire console is Behringer preamps and Behringer fader panels and Behringer D to A's, does it matter? Like, at a certain point, the
Kinda
actual
want it
end
to crash
hardware
at
is
that
what's
point, don't
what's
you?
changing the sound quality.
Stop this.
Yeah,
Stop
but,
the show.
that-
Uli called and said thank you.
That was not a function of the software. That software could
Right.
work with almost any preamps. I used
Of course.
I used Octopres and stuff like that with my rig.
Yeah, I think one.
100%.
I think one of the things that hurt the SAC. We're going to call it the SAC from now on because I just think that's funny. Was that there weren't. There it is. That there weren't a significant number of readily available mic pre's that interface to something you could get into a computer easily. And so it was the super easy on ramp was to use the ADA 8000 or 8200, the Behringer little box. And that was like a super easy way to get in. You can get a bunch of channels in and didn't cost a fortune. Otherwise, very quickly you were back to, I might as well have a console. It would be very interesting to circle back now in the age of Dante, where there's a gajillion boxes now that take pretty decent mic pre's and turn them into Dante, and you get them in a console and go and revisit the SAC, revisit the SAC, and see what kind of results you would get, because now you could actually do it at a cost point, as long as you didn't buy a whole bunch of Rios. Or
The preamps are now the most expensive part.
they really
Well,
are.
Converters, the
with
sound
a-
card converter
yeah,
is the most expensive
With
part.
the
of the whole thing.
SAC, with the SAC rig, the preamps are always the most expensive part.
Mhm.
But you could use any pretty good quality preamp. It didn't have to be a Behringer.
Well, and like I said, I think that at the time, because I remember I looked into this pretty heavily, and it was at the time, it was like the Behringer preamp was like super ridiculously cheap. And then the next step up was not insignificant, especially when you multiplied it by like 8 boxes. And then all of a sudden I'm at a price point where I might as well get a console. Like that's where we kind of were. And I feel like now, especially with like Dante stuff, like there's just a ton of other options that you could get into that the price point would make a lot of sense.
Well, I think your point about using SAC to control Dante streams is interesting. I don't know if it can, but
Well, it's, I mean, if it sees, so if you use Dante Virtual Sound Card, which appears to the computer as any sound card,
Too much
I don't see
latency.
any reason why it wouldn't see those inputs and outputs like a sound card, and it should.
It's too much latency though. You want to have something with like the PCI card or something like that with a lower latency than
True,
10
true.
milliseconds.
True, but yeah, I mean,
But
or
that's
you can do it
doable
with
as
PCI
well
cards.
because that they are available.
Yeah. Well, we're not sure. They're all they stopped.
Well,
making them
nothing's
all.
available right now.
We're not talking about that
Nothing
topic.
is available.
That only got 4 votes. This one got 5. We're not allowed to talk about that one. That one's we saved for next week.
I almost voted for that topic because never mind. I almost did.
I do have to
Tip the
say
scales.
that one of the things that I've seen people do with a lot of these in the box solutions is they end up building their own console. And I've seen some very elaborate surfaces where someone has embedded some form of fader panel into a massive wooden structure that they've then done up very nicely and lacquered up and everything, and then put monitors into it. And at the end of it, I kind of look at it and go, cool, you've built a really cool toy. How much money did you spend? And could you have saved a lot of man hours of your life just buying a Yamaha or Digico or something else? And like, I get that, like, sometimes you just want to build a toy, but like,
a lot of people like to work with wood, you know, maybe this carpentry is his thing.
And to go back to the most important topic of this whole day, Brian, Count Rugen had 11 fingers in the book, so it's actually not a reference to anything.
Well, okay. All right. So devil's advocate, had Rob Reiner read that book before he did Spinal Tap? Was the This One Goes to 11 reference directly because Count Rugen was going to have 11 fingers? I'm sorry. I'm going with no. Come on. Same guy, 11 fingers. This one goes to 11. I'm sorry. There's a connection between these two. This is
big stretch.
This is
I just say how great it is.
Same actor, same director.
I just say how great it is. Joe looked that up for us. That's great.
I do appreciate the extra help. Fred, we have not heard from you. Please give us your probably 20 cents worth, because you've had I don't know if he said this. I don't think he said it before the show, that the reason that he came on is because he spent all of like last week yelling at YouTube because he was listening to our show and was like, you guys got it wrong. So here's your chance. Here's your chance.
No, there was nothing wrong. There was nothing wrong. I just wanted to jump in on the conversation. For me, I do sports. I do live sports. So mixing in the box, I don't understand it. I don't know how it would work. And being an engineer also, you know, does mixing in the box mean that you have a console on site and then you're just remoting that console? Or is there this magic box that's like a Ferreo fish where you have 64 inputs and 64 outputs, and you can plug microphones into the inputs and you can drive monitors or IFBs or PA system or whatever with the outputs? I don't understand that part of it from an engineering standpoint. But mixing sports, I can't mix on the glass because I have 10 fingers and I use them all. I can't push one fader at a time on a glass surface. It doesn't work for me. So I can't do it.
Fred, thank you for bringing that up. I am not a sports engineer, but unfortunately, fortunately, in the last year, I've mixed a couple of sporting events. One of them was tennis, and the guy I was working for wanted me to mix remotely. And I said, why don't I do the first one on site, and then we can figure that out. And we did. We tested Mr. Broughton software because we were using Yamaha consoles. We did proof of concept, worked fine, worked great. I was on site though mixing. The next one I do of these, and this is because this has to do with the mix engine and what we're talking about now, I think, is that I would probably go to the tennis venue, set everything up with the crew, get it dialed in, and then get on a plane and go home so they don't have to put me up in the hotel for the next week, you know, and mix from there. But the stadium audio with the announcer and the music playback and all of that, now, I could fire that stuff from home, but my guess is you still want someone on site, maybe even if it's just an iPad, that's okay, you know, but you know, ideally they have their hands on faders in case, you know, oh no, you need to get more of that in there because the crowd is really pumping. And I may or may not hear that at home, depending on monitoring. So I'm putting this to you, since you have sporting experience. We've broached this subject of broadcast. And we've also broached the subject that the use case really matters. Is it music? Is it talking heads corporate? Is it sports? So forth and so, is it theater? So forth and so on. I rest my case.
Yeah. Like I said, I don't know that I could do it in the box. And then there's different, like I said, there's different ways of doing it. If you have to have preamps on site. So if you plug everything into a console and you're remotely controlling that. Right now in our COVID world, in sports, they're doing world feeds. Everybody's got a truck parked at a venue and they do a home show and they give a world feed, right? Mm-hmm. So we take a world feed, whatever it is. So you get a video source with up to 8 channels of audio attached to it. And then you take and you put that into your desk and you remotely mix the show.
Are
But
those
but you're relying on the people that are doing the home show to give you your stuff, even stuff that they're not paying attention to, such as your headsets, such as your locker room drops, such as your PLs that might need to talk to the TOC on site, whatever. It's all in their control. You've lost all sense of control there. You have to rely on that person on that end.
they're giving you
So-
stems, Fred? Those 8 channels you just
No,
spoke
no,
of?
you get individual microphones.
Okay, yeah.
Depending on what it is. Now, last year, the NBA had this mandate where you couldn't put net mics up. They had contact mics that they mounted on the backs of the boards. And it sounded awful because they didn't want to hear the people talking because there's nobody at the venues back then. Well, now we've gone back to it, but you can hear everything. It's wonderful. You're sitting and listening to an NBA game now, you're going to hear everything on the court because there's nobody there. We had one in the Phoenix Suns just played in Toronto the other night. Nobody there. No crowd noise. I don't think there was even a PA. It was amazing. But again, you're just getting all these individual microphones that hopefully somebody else isn't clipping on the other end. And then I ran into a situation like yesterday. There's a low-end production company over in Mesa, and he's got a little trailer with an X32 into it, and he wanted to. He can't get the stage boxes for his X32, so he bought an X32 rack, and then he somehow got a hold of a couple of Dante cards, which in this chip shortage thing. Sorry, I'm not talking about that, Brian. He got a couple of cards, so now I went out and I hooked up the Dante for it, and I had to try to figure out, okay, well, how do I make this console talk to this console via Dante? And the only way I could figure out to do it was there's 32 paths, but I could use 16 of them to come from this console to this console and 16 of them to go from this console to this console. So that all the auxes and the things that needed to fold back for IFBs and whatever, so we had basically a box that did 16 paths in both directions at line level. But the initial, then you had to have another network connection so that the X32 on the desk talked to the X32 rack so that you could control the head amps, because you don't want to get that out of balance. So I had to go in and basically put everything at unity gain to make all the paths correct, so you didn't clip Dante, and then you had to have a separate network connection to be able to control the console. Seemed a little extreme. It was very noisy, a lot of hiss, kind of like a Shure line amp, but it worked. So they're actually on their way to Stockton right now to do a hockey game or something tomorrow. So I just went out, put it together for him, engineered it, and I saved it as a preset and said, "Here, good luck."
Well, and you sort of kind of brought up. Yeah, there's a whole entire side topic here, which is essentially, no pun intended, what I would consider out of the box mixing, which is basically what I mean by that is just completely different ways of doing things that we have never ever tried to do before, because we're trying to do things to control COVID exposure, or trying to do things in different environments. And so, yeah, we're doing silly things like, oh, I'm going to park an X32 on that end, and I'm going to remote into the head amps with a PC, and then I'm going to bring that over the internet using Unity Connect to my console. I'm going to mix it on my CL5, and then I'm going to spit it back, Unity Connect back, and spit it out of the X32's XLR outputs. And I'm going to do all this crazy, silly routing, all so that I don't end up on the show site, which we would have never bothered to do before. But I've literally done exactly what I just said, as convoluted as that sounds, rather than me going to the show site and pushing faders on the show site.
And I was the A2 for the thing that Brian speaks of.
Which then becomes, because you also touched on it, Fred, perfectly, which is, if you do these sort of remote mixing concepts where you're literally in another city, the person who is in the city, who's your A2, who's hooking up your stuff, who's doing it's a lot bigger thing than just dropping some microphones and rolling out some DT12s and throwing some IFBs on some people. It's like, no, they need to get the routing right and the Ethernet right, and the communication between you and that person becomes super critical, because it's, I can't just walk out of the truck and go look. I have to rely on, I ask the local person the question and rely that they're going to give me the answer that's correct Nothing's going to get lost in the process. I'm
Okay, I
kind of a
gotta say
completely
one
different topic, but go ahead,
I'm going
Fred.
to say one other thing here. We never actually tested the IFB system because the IFB system's all line level and dry, right? So in that Dante conversion, is this going to really screw with them when they go to plug the headsets in? How much latency are they going to hear in their aux foldback? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's got to be some kind of latency, but we never tested it. I just put up tone and I got a Q box out there. Okay, I put tone up on aux 1. Yeah, it shows up on aux 1 out there. Great. But that doesn't tell you what it's going to do in real time.
Yeah, and I'm working with a company now where we're doing a remote mixing kind of thing, and they're dropping a local rack. And one of the things they learned the hard way was that they had to generate all of the foldback IFBs locally, even though they were sending me, much like you said, world feed kind of concept, where they just sent me all the microphones and I'm mixing them in a different location. All that I'm then dumping a mix minus back to them. That's everything but their local stuff. And that's fine. Like all the packages and all that nonsense can be 200 milliseconds behind and nobody cares. But, if Ed and Tracy are talking back and forth as the two announcers and it's 100 milliseconds of late, like, no way. Like, that's how you get announcers throwing headsets across the field. Like, that's not going to work. So there's a lot of these kinds of things. There's, the video department is doing it because they're just shipping video signals to a central control space somewhere. And so now they want the audio department to do it. And it's its own unique set of challenges, which is a whole other topic, but that's cool.
That was the one I was on yesterday. It was an interesting thing I'd never really thought about was live PA systems and delay speakers in a corporate environment. You got monitors in the front with front PA, and then you got delay speakers with monitors, but the monitors aren't delayed. So now you have lip sync issues.
Therein lies another topic for a future show. And I might add too, the other topic for a future show is that one solution to this, there's a local system integrator that's working with Harrison Mixbus, so forth and so on. What they do is they send the video and audio up to the cloud together, and they come back down separately. But at least it's basically muxing it in the cloud. That way, when you pull stuff down, it doesn't get out of sync. And I think that's brilliant. So you don't have all these multiple paths and, having to mess with that. So that sounds like maybe, I wonder if that would have solved some of this issue. At least some of it.
Doesn't solve the delay tower issue.
So the speed of sound versus the speed of light.
Right. I guess the only thing that could solve that is if you had remote control over sort of zero latency monitoring within the IFB box and all that, and blah, blah, blah.
Right. You got to delay the video quite literally.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, it is definitely a completely different topic, but it's probably right now only because I've faced it in the last 6 months, like 4 times, significant issues with delay speakers and delay screens, and having to walk clients through, if I get it right here, it's going to be wrong there. If I get it right there, it's going to be wrong here. And like that process of I can split the difference and then it'll be pretty good in the middle. It's like, physics is a wicked taskmaster.
I figure you get 60 feet of audience depth where you can get the sync correct.
Yeah, that's about right. And
that's about 2 frames, and you can tolerate 2 frames. Or it's 1 frame in either direction to make a total distance of 2 frames, and that can be acceptable. But you get outside of that, and you're just gonna have to live with it because there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, the depth of about I'm wild ass guess a 200 to 300 seat room for a corporate. The inherent video delay in the video processing is just enough that it will align correctly at about halfway back in the audience. And you end up with sort of kind of it just works. And I worked with a lot of clients that they're kind of used to that size space. And then we're doing a post-COVID show, and it's 20 or 30. It's a television show with a live audience. And so now all of a sudden the screens are, 250 milliseconds behind because of all the video processing that's always been there, but the audience is 30 feet away from the screen. And now like it's complete, and it's like, this has always been here. You just never noticed it before. We are way rabbit trailing. It's been about an hour. I think it's been a great conversation. I feel like we just barely touched on it. We went to in the box and out of the box and meant two completely different things by that, which makes my heart happy. I want to thank all of my panelists for paneling, even if they have green hair and didn't care about the topic. And not picking on anybody in particular, but thank you all for being here. And if you are listening to this on a podcast, in the description, you will see a way that you can sign up and participate on this show. If you are listening to this on YouTube, it will also be in the descriptions to how to sign up to this show and contact us. If you are interested in audio and have an opinion, you're welcome on this show. That's the end of the criteria. Your opinion doesn't have to be very good. In fact, we like bad opinions. It sort of kind of makes it entertaining. With that, I'd like to thank everybody. Thank Andy Broughton for co-hosting. And Andy, if you could roll that fabulous bean footage.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, that's